starts off with a whole bunch of space nerd talk, which I really appreciated.
I put waxes poetically about booze and space, making what he calls extreme fermented beverages. So you'll find ingredients that are commonly used for wines, beers, meads, and all this stuff kind of in one beverage.
And then we meet Michael Jackson, but not the Michael Jackson.
No moonwalking.
No moonwalking. Sour, and that's not a thing a king would drink. And like, sours are actually a popular beer now.
I know, and I don't know why.
Not for me either. He asked Sam if he had a beer lab, and Sam said yes. And it wasn't clarified that he was referencing his Labrador Retriever. Not an actual
That's right. I
laboratory.
forgot about that part, which that's so fun.
I liked it a lot. If you are a brewer, you should definitely check out this book because all of the beers, he has recipes and detailed recipes on how they're made.
And food pairings.
Welcome to Archaeology Books for Fun, digging books that aren't drier than dirt. I'm your host, Tristan Herenstein, and with me as always is my co-host, Barbara Clark.
Hey, everybody.
So last time we finished up reading the book, 9 Lives of Florida's Famous Key Marco Cat. So this week we are moving on to a new book, Ancient Brews, by
Patrick McGovern.
By Patrick McGovern, yes. As per usual, before we do that, a little bit of housekeeping. If you like this podcast, please like, subscribe, leave a comment, whatever is appropriate on a platform you're listening to this through. And if you like this podcast and want to support the work we do here at FPAN, there will be a link in the description. Please consider leaving us a donation. That would be lovely. If you don't feel like you can do that, that is fine. Leaving us a comment and subscribe is still a very big deal, and we really, really appreciate that kind of feedback as well. So yes, we decided to read about the things that archaeologists love most beyond artifacts, I would say.
Yes.
So yes, just so you're all aware, there will be a lot of discussion of alcohol and such in these next few episodes. If that is a problem for you and you need to bow out, that is fine. Just want everyone to be aware of that. And I will say that this is sometimes an issue for archaeologists as well.
Yes, it is. Yes.
I had a friend ages ago who joked, but not really joked, that all archaeologists either die of skin cancer or liver disease.
There's been academic papers written about issues pertaining to alcohol in our field.
Yep.
Yeah.
And if you think about, well, that's really odd. Why would that be? If you think about how field work works, right? You go out into an area, a small town. What do you have to do after work in this place you don't know?
The bar.
Go to the bar.
Yep.
You know, there are still, though this is all changing, thankfully, but there are still an awful lot of archaeologists who are also smokers for similar reasons.
Mm-hmm.
And I will say I really appreciate the younger generation of archaeologists right now are kind of forcing some conversations around this culture we've had for a long time around drinking. And I think that's a good move overall for sure.
Yes. I would agree with that. And I mean, when your profession has academic papers written about this issue, that means it's definitely prevalent and it's time to address it.
And I mean, we know people who have a problem.
Yeah.
So it's not a small issue.
Right.
So that serious discussion aside, we're not going to be dwelling on that too much here.
No, this book is not about that.
Right.
Thank goodness. That wouldn't be a great book. This is about essentially the archaeology of fermented beverages, which is, it's really cool. And it's interesting to see how long people have incorporated fermented beverages into their culture.
Especially appreciated how culturally relevant all of this is. Like, this is not, you think of it as like, oh, it's just something we do for the party or whatever. It's like, no, it actually has, even for us, it has more significant cultural relevance than you might expect. Like the social implications of parties that include alcohol are pretty dramatic.
Yeah, no, and it does kind of give you a different perspective on alcohol. And, you know, a lot of times I think in our culture, we have been taught for reasons like we were just discussing that alcohol is not a good thing, right? It's a bad thing. It's a negative thing, but obviously used in moderation and in certain circumstances, it can be beneficial.
Right. It has its values. So I guess let's go ahead and just dive right in to the book, huh?
Yeah.
We read through the first 3 chapters this time, if you're reading along, and it starts off with a preface that I found actually a really good preface.
And I think it's, in some books you can kind of get away without reading the preface and the forewords and all the stuff before chapter 1. I think in this book, it's kind of important to start with that.
Agreed.
Because he discusses the scientific processes they use. And obviously we don't have to go in great detail, but it gives you some background knowledge going forward.
Well, he lays out the common process from discovery to analysis to experimentation that's common for all of them. And so he lays that out, and it gives you a good orientation for each of these episodes, I feel like.
Yeah, I agree.
Like we said, we don't need to go into a ton of detail. The author talked a lot about the lab he works for, so he works for the Penn Museum.
Again.
Yep, Penn Museum comes up once again, and he has a chemical analysis lab there. He talked about how poorly funded it, I think, was. I have some implications through this book that they've been getting better funding.
Yeah, it sounds like, throughout, and I think this is what often happens with research, right, is once you've kind of proven yourself and proven that it can be done, you're able to get more funding through different various sources, whether it be donations or grants or whatever. So I think that's kind of what has occurred.
And they, as far as the samples they work with, they're often either residues at the bottoms of jugs. Sometimes I think it's actually liquids, or they can actually pull residue from the pores in ceramics.
Which is so cool.
Right. So there's a lot they can do.
Yeah. And I was just surprised because, you and I have both been interested in this, but we haven't really known the specifics.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems like it's a lot more complicated, and there's a lot more methods to utilize to extract this information than I realized. Like, I thought it was there was probably one thing you did and it got you all the information you need, but there's various methods that you can use to extract different information, and I just thought that was really cool. Very sciencey.
Yes, indeed.
Yay, science. He also, so Patrick McGovern is an archaeologist and a chemist. He's a biomolecular archaeologist. Is that the correct terminology? Yes. I had to write that down. But again, as I think we've said before, there's a lot of specialization in archaeology, and archaeology is really cool because it utilizes a bunch of different sciences, and in this case, a lot of chemistry. And he talks a lot about his partnerships that he's developed. And the one that's, I guess, most pervasive in this book is with Sam Calagione. He is the founder of Dogfish Head Craft Brewery. And he talks a lot about their relationship, which I appreciate because as you and I feel like you and I have a good working relationship, and it sounds like they do as well. So, Sam is kind of the creative mind, the brewer, and Patrick McGovern is the science nerd, essentially. And I think they found a good working relationship.
Yeah. There's appreciating the other specialty, basically.
Yeah.
Sounds like, anyway, yeah. I did appreciate a comment on finding samples. He says, quote, "Artifacts or ecofacts of interest should not be overly washed in water or conserved with any chemical that might interfere with analysis."
Yeah,
i.e. the key marker.
I actually made that exact same note.
Yep.
And I feel like it's interesting because standard practice in archaeology is to get the artifacts, to wash them as you're processing them. And it seems like with this technology, and I think there's some other technologies out there as well, you have to think ahead about how you're going to use these artifacts to do analysis and incorporate that into how you process the artifacts ahead of time, which is different than I've ever done. We kind of, all the projects I've on, you kind of go into like auto mode, and it's just take the artifact, wash them. I mean, there's some obviously flotation samples and things like that, but
I think when charcoal, so C14 has reached a point where it doesn't matter basically if we touch it, but there used to be a time where it mattered a lot.
Yeah, that's true.
Then they were a lot, I've been on some where they were a lot more intentional about that sort of thing.
Yeah, that's fair.
That hasn't been for a while, I don't think.
Yeah.
He goes into a whole bunch of the different tests that they do here. He doesn't go on and on, we definitely don't need to list them because they don't necessarily mean a lot unless you're into chemistry, but he does a good job laying them out, and this is what we do, but not going on about it too much, I felt like.
Yeah, I appreciated that because I feel like, especially as you read along, his passion for this is very apparent. And a lot of times when people are very passionate about something, it's hard not to lay out all the details and minutia, whether or not the person reading or listening wants to hear about them.
A lot of archaeologists have trouble with that.
So I appreciate that.
He mentions some of the ways they get ideas of what could have been used in these beverages is through chemical analysis. That doesn't tell them like, this seed was used, but this type of acid is present, and then this acid is in these fruits, that kind of a thing.
Yeah.
And so they basically need to figure out what they may have had available to them at the time through other archaeological means. Remember how important context is, right?
Yes.
Because, hey, we excavated this site, we found this jug there, and we found these seeds there. Then we know they had those seeds available to them. He does mention, too, a thing he calls it wet flotation. Is there anything other than a wet flotation?
I know. I was thinking about that, too. I was like, that seems redundant to me.
So the idea of flotation, folks, if you think of an archaeologist screening dirt, right? And the dirt just falls through. Wet flotation is designed to separate things that float from things that don't. You can be simple as a couple buckets they've set up with some screens to like actual machines designated to doing this. I've mostly worked in those machines actually.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just you pour in the sample and then it runs cycles water through, and then the stuff that floats runs off into another screen. And so that's a good way of getting seeds and leaves and sticks and things separated from gravel and that kind of thing.
A lot of your like organics will float. Your leaves.
Plant organics or burned organics too, I think. Yeah,
but
so it's good though.
And that gives them information about, like you said, the context in which they can help narrow down what those chemicals are telling them.
And we definitely don't do that with everything.
Yeah,
we take specific samples. Sometimes it's just a generic sample of what was here in the dirt, but also if we find like maybe a fire pit or something, we'll take a sample from that.
And I thought it was interesting too, because he talked about how they also utilize soil analysis to kind of exclude certain things that might be interfering with their chemical analysis. Contaminants or whatever. But so it's a lot more complicated than I thought or realized. I guess I never really thought much about it. I just thought it was cool.
Yep. He does talk a little bit at the end about actually like making the authentic beverage and some of the kind of the shortcomings of that. They have to assume quite a bit. And he does talk about this on a case-by-case basis where they assume things. He does a very good job of talking about compromises they've made.
Right. Yeah. Like, a lot of your ancient beverages would have been naturally fermented by wild yeast. Like think, an ancient brewery, they would have had yeast just floating around in the rafters that would fall down, or bugs was a cool one. Also, the fruit that they're using contained wild yeast. So, and an interesting thing is they were brewing these beverages before they even knew what yeast was.
Right.
So they just knew the process worked through trial and error, essentially.
Well, we didn't know what yeast was until fairly recently.
Yeah, because the Reinheitsgebot, and don't come at me if I pronounced that wrong, guys, is the German purity law. And it narrowed down brewing to water, hops, and grains. And then yeast was added about 500 years after that law was put in place, when they realized the role yeast plays in brewing.
Well, they realized that yeast was a thing.
Yeah,
too.
Exactly, because it's microscopic.
Right.
But I just think it's neat how, we as humans can develop these processes not necessarily knowing what we're doing. We just know that it works. And that's just kind of cool to me to think about. But he talks about how, they didn't necessarily have access to the same type of yeast. So they would use yeast that are manufactured and created just for the purpose of brewing, steel vats instead of whatever would have been used through. And I guess they do some of that later on with experimental archaeology, which is cool.
Yep, it is very cool. Agreed. So chapter 1, this is kind of the science chapter, basically. Most of the rest of the chapters, as far as I can tell so far, are about a specific beverage they've studied and recreated. This is more of a overall thing, and it starts off with a whole bunch of space nerd talk, which I really appreciated.
I put waxes poetically about booze and space.
Yes, apparently there's a lot of booze in space, folks.
Yes.
And apparently sounds like some fairly tasty booze.
Right. Yeah. Oh, he talks a little bit about the DNA of various like fungi and plants and stuff like that have been used in brewing. And again, we've just recently kind of come to understand them at like a molecular level, but we've been using them for centuries, essentially.
Right. Certain genes and stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and he talks about alcohol in the natural world and how animals can encounter or even seek out fermented fruits and such and get drunk from them.
And people have been studying that and how different animals have different tolerances for alcohol. Like some will drink it and not really see the effects like we would. And he talks a little bit about like the evolution of that.
Well, like the shrew.
Yes. Yes.
This little thing goes around and drinks basically fermented nectar, I think it was.
Yeah,
And drinks equivalent of 9 glasses of 12% wine a night.
I know.
A shrew. That's wild.
But
But no
he's-
sign of intoxication from that.
Which, good for the shrew.
Yeah.
And then there's me who has 2 beers and I'm like, I want to take a nap.
Yep. So yes, there's a lot of alcohol around. He talks about monkeys and apes in particular
Yeah,
as a closest relative to humans. Basically, it's useful to like look at how they do it. And people have observed that when monkeys drink, they become more sociable, and it might actually serve a kind of an important function towards the group as a whole. There.
Yeah, I love the whole, like, what do they call it? The drunk monkey hypothesis?
Yeah.
It's so cool. Yeah.
He hypothesizes too here that, alcoholism has become a problem just because it's always available now.
Right.
Whereas in most of ancient humans past, alcohol was a seasonal thing you came across. You didn't even produce it. It's just like, oh yes, this is the time to eat these,
Yep. Yeah, it's interesting because I've heard kind of the same thing said with food, how our bodies and our metabolism haven't really caught up to the fact that we always have all this food available to us, like at our fingertips. And I guess the same is kind of true of alcohol.
And there are some advantages to eating the fermented things beyond the alcohol too, because they are partially digested and they're easier for whatever eats it to process that. There's a lot of little details on nature's interaction and early humans interactions with alcohol here.
Yeah.
I don't know that we need to go through all of it, but we're picking out some of the stuff that interested us.
Well, and also, starting when we did start to brew it, a lot of times it was used medicinally.
Mm-hmm.
Oftentimes, drinking an alcoholic beverage, whether it be beer, mead, whatever, was safer than drinking the water.
Yeah. Well, and it made the water safe.
Yeah.
That was actually a thing I thought was really cool I'd never considered. So the yeast producing high alcohol is actually a evolutionary developed adaptation to basically killing off the competition.
I know. That was fascinating to me.
So they actually produce so much alcohol that the competition dies out, and now that nothing has access to this food source except for this particular yeast.
Yeah, just so
So
cool.
basically, by doing that, they are cleaning the water for us.
Right.
Which is fascinating.
Yeah. It's amazing.
Yeah.
Nature knows what
I
it's
just
doing.
always thought, alcohol, it kills things. I hadn't really thought about the yeast is biologically, this is what they're designed to do for
I
that
know.
purpose.
Yeah.
And then we talk a little bit about the microbrewery scene, which is actually interesting. I do know this has spread around the world, but in the US, this was kind of a bit of a revolution.
Yeah.
Because for so long, the US was dominated by, I think they said the big three
Mm-hmm.
companies.
A lot of people, like, I don't want to name names really, but you know who they are.
Right. And they were well known outside of America as terrible beers.
Right. They were they stuck to like the Reinheitsgebot. They were very basic, very but if you think about it too, I mean, I know a lot of people like poo-poo them or whatever. When you think about at a marketing standpoint, making it kind of broadly appealing makes sense. Whereas like craft brewing, you're looking for like a niche.
And people going to those are looking for like new experiences, right? Not necessarily. Yeah. So I understand why it happened. But yeah, so around 95, apparently, this started up. I wasn't really aware of this scene until, let's say, maybe 07, 08, when I really became aware of it.
Yeah, that sounds about right. I think it started more like in the West Coast and kind of worked its way to the East Coast.
That was in Colorado when I kind of became aware of it, because it was blowing up. Like every town in Colorado at that time, which is nothing to now. Every town has 2 or 3, it seems like.
And also,
but that was a big deal then.
I do know, full disclosure, I work at a brewery part-time for funsies to pay for expensive hobbies, but there are different states that have different laws, and a lot of times those laws inhibited the growth of the craft brewing industry in that state. So they took lobbying and things like that a lot of times to
and those
develop.
laws were by design.
Yeah. Oh yeah, as every law is, right? Yeah.
Right? So yeah.
And you also had cultural things too, right? We're in the Bible Belt, and
we did have prohibition.
Yeah,
it's a long time, not in memory to anyone, but it was a thing, and it has its echoing effects.
Which I don't know. I think it's in a later chapter, but he talks about like the alcohol and tobacco bureaus and stuff like that, and their development was through the Prohibition era. Which I never really thought about it, but that makes sense. We have in our culture today, we have like beer, wine, mead, like all these different beverages, seltzers that are all kind of very distinct from each other. But it turns out historically and prehistorically, I guess, that wasn't necessarily the case. They were taking what was available to them and making what he calls extreme fermented beverages. So you'll find ingredients that are commonly used for wines, beers, meads, and all this stuff kind of in one beverage. And he discusses a little bit.
And then also lots of herbs and spices too.
Yeah. So like all this stuff that we wouldn't necessarily, well, I guess now we kind of think of it going in beers because of the craft brewing industry. But like prior to that, especially thinking about like those purity laws, you didn't put this stuff in beers. There wasn't that, I guess, creativeness. And he was trying to make the point like, people were utilizing what was around them and they didn't have these very strict definitions of what made certain beverages. It was what you got your hands on and how you made it.
Yep. So an extreme fermented beverage is, not just beer, not just wine. It is a mix of a bunch of different, and not even just mix of alcohols, but it's also, like I said, herbs and spices. And so basically most craft beers, I think, would qualify as extreme fermented beverages now.
Yeah. And, these would have been regional differences, even within like the same country or continent. There would be differences because you're using what was available. It's just very cool.
Chapter 2, this is basically all about the beer they developed called Midas Touch, which is the first one they developed. And it's probably the most famous one as far as I'm aware.
Yes, this is the only one I've tried.
Yeah. And I did look at some of our local stores. I couldn't find any.
I remember the way I came across Midas Touch, because it wasn't available here in Tallahassee, but I happened to go down to South Florida for a friend's bridal shower. And after the bridal shower, I was like, you guys, somebody needs to take me to this liquor store. I went online and they have Midas Touch. And I went and I bought like every bottle they had and brought it home.
Yeah, so Midas Touch, the journey to Midas Touch started with a site called Midas Tumulus in Turkey. And basically the Penn Museum had done work there in 1957.
Yep.
And collected a bunch of samples. This is one thing I find interesting because we've talked a lot about repatriation here. And the author basically does, with current stuff, he basically talks about how, the agreement was set up and that kind of a thing. But with 1957 stuff, I wonder, he doesn't really touch on how does Turkey feel about the Penn Museum having some of these things.
Yeah, and I wonder if that's just because, you could write a whole book on that alone,
Right.
But I do wonder, like, I feel like maybe at least an acknowledgement would have been cool.
Well, or maybe it's a non-issue.
Yeah.
Right? Maybe Turkey's like, great, we don't want this stuff back. I don't know.
Right.
But I feel like a paragraph or two, like he acknowledges it with like the next one when he's taking samples in like modern day back to America for study. So I don't know. So the site is a pretty prominent site, and it's based off of, there's a city and a fortified area, and then tombs as well. And the Midas tomb is named because it actually, initially, for sure, they thought it was from the era of Midas, King Midas, golden touched thing. Now they think it may have been his father.
Right. Yeah.
But still, it's still called that. It's still from that era.
And how they've determined that is at least somewhat through dendrochronology, which, we appreciate, which is essentially dating a site by looking at wood remains that are there and putting them in a sequence. Of course, you have to have a known sequence for that area, like, dating, counting tree rings, essentially, kind of fitting them into that sequence. And that'll tell you approximately how old, when that tree was cut down, which is an important factor to
Important distinction, especially in an arid climate.
Yeah.
And so essentially, if you think about tree rings, you think some are narrower and some are wider. Narrower are maybe some dry climates, wider are some wet times when the tree grew a lot. And so trees that have overlapping timeline will have the same pattern of tree rings, essentially.
But you have to have that baseline knowledge of the tree rings for that particular area, and then take your specific sample from the site and match it to that.
and take into account if you're in an arid climate, like
Yeah.
out in the American West, wood will just sit on the ground for centuries.
Right. And then somebody could come along and pick it up and build something with it.
Right.
So it tells you that's again why you have to use other information as well to help you date the site. You can't just rely on a single piece of information like this.
Yep, multiple sources for sure. He mentions how this was interesting, and we both had a little discussion about this, how the tomb was made of wood. It's the oldest standing wooden structure in the world right now, at least when he wrote this.
Mm-hmm.
And it was hermetically sealed, which was interesting because I don't think of wood being something you do a hermetic seal with.
And I tried to look more into this, and no article I found could give like specifics. But there are some photos of it. And so I'm wondering if it was you had the logs, but then you had other substances around the logs, and then it was sealed and it just became more of like an anaerobic environment. So I don't think it was, because I always think of hermetically sealed in like a modern sense where they do it with like windows and, things like that, and they do it on purpose.
Mm-hmm.
But I think in this case, it was like a natural process of it just lacking oxygen over time.
Or some intention. They intended it to be sealed, probably.
Yeah, but I don't think they were like, let's hermetically seal this. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. And I did look it up, and it seems like there are other cases of like wooden things being hermetically sealed, and so that makes sense.
And I've heard it in reference to like the Egyptian pyramids too. Some saying, but how accurate that is, I don't know, because it's always on like some documentary on like the Discovery Channel or something.
And I did note that when he observes that it's the oldest intact structure in the world, and so naturally they had to cut through it and be in there. It was 1957,
Yeah, right.
But also, I don't know that you would not do that now. Anyway.
I think the difference is we would probably document the process more thoroughly and
be
take
more
samples.
intentional probably in how we did it.
Yeah.
57 for sure. So yes, preservation was amazing. Lots of drinking vessels, and so it's about 8th century BCE.
Yeah, and he introduces beer stone, which is, and I always mess up this word, Tristan, calcium oxalate, which in these different vessels, which I guess some were like bronze and stuff like that. I don't know, but it's an accumulation of like the calcium and stuff from the beer that like comes at the bottom of the vessel, and so you can use that for analysis.
It's toxic, right?
Yeah. So this I thought was interesting too, is, these days we drink beer out of a pint glass and most people wouldn't use a straw, but they used to use straws and things like that to avoid the beer stone, or avoid the stuff that would be floating around in it. It wasn't filtered. But yeah, they would have to clean the vessels in order to get as much of the beer stone as they can out of it between uses, I guess. Or at least that's the theory.
Right. And so they think that these were alcohol because they knew how important alcohol was to the culture at the time. Like this culture is specifically famous for its alcoholic beverages. And there are records of that. They found, with chemical analysis, they found tartaric acid.
Mm-hmm, yeah.
Which suggests a certain kind of grape, Eurasian grape.
Yeah. They also found, I think, like honey, honey residue or something.
Yeah. And then grains, I think, too, right?
Mm-hmm, yeah.
So it was basically all three together. Oh, honey and beeswax, right?
That's right, beeswax.
Yeah. And they were, he noticed how they were like shocked at how disgusting this sounded. Because remember at this time, the craft brewery thing hadn't really taken off.
Right.
It wasn't common. They're used to their standard
American lagers or whatever.
American lager beers, yeah. So this was maybe a bit shocking and didn't sound good until they tried it later, of course.
Right. And like when I was reading this, I was like, ooh, that sounds like it could be really good.
Right. Yeah.
So it's interesting how our perspective has changed.
Yeah, I appreciate they put that in there because it was not what I was thinking at all. They had a good context for the culture. Stuff in the tomb preservation was really good. They had good information for what may have been in there or the sorts of things that may have been in there. So this was kind of an ideal situation to actually try and recreate and try some experimental archaeology. He mentions there's a lot missing, right? So how do you you process things? How, there's they'll talk about this later too, but some ideas of like how the grains would have been processed before it was chewed by humans and then spit out. And the saliva actually helps get some of that started. But there's a bunch of different ways these things can actually be done.
Yeah. And then like in what quantities, like what were essentially were the recipes, we don't know that. And like also I thought it was interesting. He talks about how the time of year in which the king was buried could affect the ingredients as well.
Right.
Not only, I guess, the potency, but also like, were they fresh grapes or were they raisins?
Right.
And how that would have changed the brewing process as well as the taste and all that stuff too.
But I guess the residue was like very, very yellow.
Yeah.
And there's questions too, like were the different, the wine and the meat and the beer all done separate and then mixed together later? Or they all brewed together? I found it interesting that they thought it was impossible this was all brewed together.
Yeah.
Which I think now they think is actually what was going on.
Right.
So lots of questions. What kinds of grapes? What kinds of grains? What kinds of, and then how did they process it? And then we go on a short interlude.
Yeah, this is weird. I did enjoy it.
I understand the idea.
Yeah. So he talks about in high school, he went on a trip to Bavaria, your backpacking through Europe kind of situation that I guess a lot of people supposedly do. Although I've never actually met someone who's done it.
Right.
And he just kind of goes off this tangent. And I see why he did it.
Mm-hmm.
But when I started reading this, I was like, what's happening here?
Yeah. So his point is through this, he experienced more flavorful and richer beers than what he was used to finding in America.
Right. And which in the context of the time I get. But
right.
I was just like, what's happening here?
Yeah. And so I think it was about here, or maybe it was the next chapter, I started to realize kind of something interesting with this book. There are a lot of things about it that this Lost City, the Monkey God also did. And that one drove us nuts.
Right.
And this is just some of that same stuff, but it's better.
It's better, and I feel there's something wholesome about it.
Right.
It's like
it's an enthusiasm, which the other guy had too, but it doesn't have the undercurrents that we had real problems with in the other book.
Yeah, no, this is just like, man,
I love this stuff. Yeah.
I love this stuff. It's great. It's
right.
fun, and his passion shows through, but it's in a wholesome
and frankly,
way.
It's better written.
It is, yes.
It's just better written.
Yeah.
It's more enjoyable to read these little tangent stories.
Yeah.
So I found that I had a little bit of wait, we complained about this
I know.
before.
I was like, wait, I'm supposed to hate this.
Yeah. But it's kind of fun.
Yeah.
So, yes, I definitely recommend this book so far, if you can't tell. And then we meet Michael Jackson, but not the Michael Jackson.
No moonwalking.
No moonwalking.
He's a beer and scotch expert.
Right.
So, different Michael Jackson. But this part blows my mind, and I want to be there.
Yeah, right.
So, I guess since 1971, Michael Jackson has done this like annual beer tasting at the Penn Museum. And it sounds like there was a food pairing situation, maybe. Is this the one that was like a dinner?
Yes.
Yeah.
But it was all different brewers and stuff bringing samples of their things.
Right.
And so they're all just, honestly, it kind of makes me think of like the beer version of J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis and the other writing buddies all getting together at the bar and just like talking about stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, this is kind of where some of this happened. What we have now. This is where a lot of this started, it seems like.
Yeah, I guess they had an idea of what the ingredients were and stuff like that. And they were like, hey guys, come at us with your coolest brew. And so everybody who was like a home brewer, which was, a big hobby at that time, was like, all right, challenge accepted.
Yeah, so like the next day, like 20 of them showed up to the lab, but he wasn't expecting anyone, and there's a lot of enthusiasm.
And I guess one of those folks was Sam.
Yep.
So
and they did get a lot of different entries, basically. And essentially the idea was like, let's do a competition. The one that is picked will be present for the reenacted king's funeral feast that we're going to do. And there was at least one other one he noted as particularly good, but he did note that a lot of them were variations of palatable.
Right. Which, I've been to like beer festivals and stuff, and sometimes you drink one and you're like, yep, nope, that was a bad life choice right there. And I can just imagine.
especially like, was it one of these he observes was sour, and that's not a thing a king would drink. And like, sours are actually a popular beer now.
I know, and I don't know why.
Not for me either. But like, I could totally see, that being a niche cultural thing.
Yeah.
This culture really likes sour drinks.
Yeah. But I wonder if at the time, well, and it's things like Berliners and stuff are slightly sour too.
Right.
So I don't know.
But he was expecting a sweeter thing, which is fine. This is their interpretation, and he acknowledges a lot of these shortcomings too, I would say. One of the ingredients that I don't know if they had a chemical suggestion. Well, okay, so saffron was one of the ingredients he suggested that was involved in this beverage.
Yeah, and I think it was because of the yellow coloring,
Right.
partially at least.
But it's a bit of a problem because saffron is apparently the most expensive spice in the
Yeah.
world right now. Outdoes like truffles and caviar and stuff.
Yeah, yeah.
So apparently Sam went all in though and said it's the most expensive thing he's ever made.
Which I appreciate because, he was like, if we're going to do this, we're going to do it.
Yeah. And then there are things like, with 2 row barley, 6 row barley, what kind of barley were they using?
Yeah.
But like, he acknowledges lots of possible different interpretations than what they ended up with.
But I guess Sam won the competition.
Sam won the competition.
And they had this whole...
Because he had a beer lab.
He was also... Yeah, he had a craft brewery, so...
Well, a lot of them did, but the author acknowledged that he asked Sam if he had a beer lab, and Sam said yes. And it wasn't clarified that he was referencing his Labrador Retriever. Not an actual
That's right, I
laboratory.
forgot about that part, which... That's so fun.
I liked it a lot.
It makes me like Sam.
Uh-huh.
I'm like, I like this guy.
There's some nice touch about, so they produced it. It was a big success. They had the feast. It went well. But could they actually produce this commercially?
Yeah.
I guess it was a little uncomfortable at the time because Dogfish Head Brewery was not on stable footing at that point.
Yeah,
yet.
it was a new brewery
And the whole brewing thing was a new idea, and a lot of them were going under.
Yeah, the competition was stiff.
Well, the competition and getting people to accept this new idea, I think, was part of it, and a lot of things.
Like craft breweries, there's such a high startup cost with all the equipment and things. So
yeah. So it was a little uncertain if they could manage this, but the author and his wife apparently gave them a loan.
Yeah, I know.
Which I thought was kind of cool. So like you can kind of, the author says it, but you kind of get a sense of how deep this friendship was actually. Yeah. He talks about, I wasn't expecting this, but I like how they talked about like the nuance of like naming the beer and making the label and that kind of a thing. I like that he adds those things because they ran into some like law issues because they wanted to call it an elixir at first because it's a mix of things. The laws didn't like that because of connotations of elixir with like cure-alls and
patent medicines. Yeah, the ATF was like, hard pass.
Yeah.
Which is fair, but it's something that I wouldn't have thought of because especially like with a brew like this, elixir just sounds cool.
It does. Yeah.
ATF being the wet blanket.
And then for good reason. They had some issues with could they even call it a beer?
Yeah.
And he talks about basically how they got around it. My favorite one was beer has to have hops through the law. So they added like 0.001% hops.
Which was like the bare minimum you could have to
there
be
was
a
no
beer.
bare minimum. So they just we'll just add like a hop.
Which I was surprised that the law allows for such a low.
It just had never been defined, probably.
Yeah, so I like it.
Yep. So it finally came out in 2001. They had some bottling issues because they were doing it in larger bottles and they were using corks, but things were a little uneven in like the carbonation. So like some of them would leak. There was varying amounts inside. Oh, and it had to be like a manual.
Yeah,
machine
they were manually
too.
corking them. So there was also issues about, I guess, how far the cork went into the bottle, and sometimes it came out, and there was also safety concerns.
Apparently, the person running it almost lost a digit, and then they abandoned this whole idea after that. So then they switched to smaller bottles with caps.
And I guess that was also they were using. One thing I appreciated too was they were using clear bottles.
Mm-hmm. So you could see the pretty yellow.
Yeah, so you could see how pretty the beer was, but it also allowed for UV light to penetrate and ruin the beer.
Right.
So they switched to smaller brown bottles. And you could buy it like in a 4-pack. And they also did that around the time when sales of it were starting to dwindle.
Apparently it brought it back.
Yeah, yeah.
And it did really well, I guess. It won a bunch of awards. And So it got enough attention that the British TV special was done, recreating it in Turkey.
Yeah, it sounds like there were quite a few recreated to various degrees.
This
But
was one that
yeah,
stood out to him, I guess. So they did a hour-long special, and they partnered with a local town, which is awesome, actually. And the town produced a bunch of foods and things, and then they couldn't import the drink, so they actually had a local do it, and the author was not impressed with
yeah, I
the-
guess it was like a local winery,
Yeah.
which I would assume the equipment, while maybe somewhat similar, is also probably very different.
And I could see like an established winery, we make wine, maybe not being as willing to experiment and go a little hog wild with it.
yeah.
Right? Like a craft brewer who's just having a lot of fun.
One of the other things that when they were having this meal, of course, you can't have a meal without food. So they tried to recreate a meal based on archaeological evidence. And one of the things that stood out to me is they knew it was probably a stew rather than like a plated meat because there was the lack of bone at the site. And I was like, oh, fascinating.
Yeah.
You know, that's
so again,
just a cool
context, right?
Yeah, context. There's also like cultural information that shows that stews would have been popular and common at that time. And that just stood out to me because it's not maybe something that I would have thought of. But yeah, lack of bone would signify.
At Midas Touch's debut, I think they did do a stew. But when the local village did it, it wasn't something they were comfortable doing or wanted to do.
Yeah.
Actually, he said for a lot of the other ones, the local chefs were less comfortable doing a stew. I think it's just because stew is considered lower class.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Stew is just what you put your little bits and bobs in.
Right.
Not necessarily a meal that you would consider by our standards fit for a king.
Right.
It's interesting how our standards have changed.
All right, so next up in chapter 3, this is all about I guess it's the next one they started working on, but it wasn't the next one they produced, timeline-wise. But this is called Chateau Jiahu.
No, you're gonna, of course, Tristan's pronunciation for Chinese words is gonna be a lot better than mine.
This is the one time when we have a name in another language, and I'm able to say it, so I'm going to say it.
I was saying Jiahu.
So this one is based off of evidence of from 9,000 years ago, which is amazing.
So cool.
And so he talks a little about China and its archaeology and its history. He was kind of laments that there's an awful lot of containers that have been recovered that have never been sampled chemically.
Which I did my field school in China, and I just remember being blown away by the amount of ceramic that comes out of the sites that you excavate there. So I mean, I feel like that track, because there's probably just so many, and unless that is your specific interest, why would you?
Yeah, well, and if you spend all your time on, stuff that's 50 years old, you're never going to maybe get down to this, the 2,000 or 9,000 year old stuff you want to get to, right?
They have so much.
Right. So I understand it's a very different situation. I think it's very similar in at least parts of Europe as well.
Yeah,
They'll do similar things, but to us, like, archaeology is everywhere, but it's not typically as dense in the Americas as it is in these other places. So yeah, there's a lot of details about brewing and such. Apparently China has the oldest known brewery. It's built underground, dates about 3000 BCE.
Yeah.
So, about 5,000 years old, which is amazing. This is a dedicated building to brewing.
Right.
5,000 years ago. And he talks about what they would have had available. So this one had like barley, but they know barley would have probably been introduced from the West. In this case,
I did find like that whole conversation really fascinating, just the amount of plants and how they would have acquired them. And, because China to me is it was very lush. I remember it being very lush when I was there. I mean, I know there are parts that are arid and stuff like that, but it's so different from like, say, Africa or something where you're probably way more limited on ingredients. Here you have like more herbs and spices and stuff like that, possibly.
Maybe. I feel like people are using local stuff everywhere too, though.
No, they are. I just think there might be, because of the environment, a greater variety.
I see what you mean.
Yeah.
Like tropical,
yeah.
just more plants.
Yeah.
I get you. Yeah, okay. And kind of the point of this, I think, is to try and set up what they think the 9,000-year-old beverage may have had available to it.
Right. Yeah.
Right? So they had this, they didn't have this. And, a 5,000-year-old beverage had this, but we don't think they had it 9,000 years ago. So that's kind of what he's doing here, I think, what the purpose is. So yeah, he talks about CN and a bunch of stuff, and it feels a little unrelated, but I think he's establishing what was available, like I said, but also how culturally relevant this whole thing was throughout China's long history.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Because I was like, wait, why are the terracotta soldiers being introduced here?
Right.
Because it doesn't have anything to do with that. But yeah.
And Xi'an is not far from the Jiahu site. And so the author is ultimately invited to join an expedition to try and find some samples basically for him to test.
Well, what I thought was really cool, I didn't realize this. Don't let my field school professors know. But China had been making pottery as early as 16,000 years ago.
Yeah.
What?
Well, we know that now. I think it wasn't that long ago that was established at the point of this expedition even.
No, it wasn't known, but it's just like, what? And also, like, I guess as part of this expedition, they learned that they were brewing beverages, fermented beverages, a lot earlier than they had previously thought.
Right. And that's a lot earlier than we thought any humans were doing pottery.
Yeah.
So yeah, he has a local Chinese archaeologist guiding him around, showing him places, introducing him to various Chinese cultural things. And he observes that toasting with alcoholic beverages was a very important part of a lot of this. And he talks a little bit about the alcoholic beverages themselves. And then ultimately they go to Zhengzhou City and meet the local archaeologist there. And he's basically like, pick some samples. And so they've got, all the Chinese archaeologists were very excited by this project. It sounded like, which sounds like a lot of fun to like work with them.
It sounds like he had a lot of fun just going and visiting and chatting with these folks. But he picked, I think, 16 shirts. Not shards, shirts. I appreciate he used the correct terminology here.
I would expect him to.
I know. I was looking for it though.
I didn't even pay attention to it. I might have noticed if he used it wrong though.
It's one of my like things that irk me is when people say shards instead of shirts. Shards is pottery. Shards is glass.
And unless you're an archaeologist, it really doesn't matter.
Sure.
He does talk a little bit about their help and their enthusiasm for the project kind of allowed him to take these things out of the country.
Yeah.
Because for very understandable reasons we've talked about in other books, China and a lot of countries are very sensitive about people taking things from their country for good reasons.
Yep.
But they got that handled, and he can't wait to go get started, basically. Then he talks a little about the Jiahu culture, Jiahu site. It's about 7,000 years old.
I know.
Oh, yeah. No, rice cultivation.
Right.
7,000 years ago. Pottery fired at 900 degrees Celsius, which means kilns, which is amazing.
Yeah.
Long distance trade, dog burials, and the earliest playable instruments.
What did he mean by playable instrument? Like, what does playable mean in that context? I was curious about. Like, because at first I was like, aren't all instruments by definition playable?
Maybe the
Does he mean still playable? Like they were intact?
It could be still playable. I'm thinking about it too, and I'm not really sure. It could, I suppose, be he might be like excluding drums as a separate, as like this is something you have to like.
That's what I was wondering. I wish
because drums don't have necessarily like you don't make a song with just drum. I'm not speaking correctly here, but you can't play notes with drums necessarily. Some of them you can, I know.
Yeah. Okay. I see.
Maybe
what you're
that's
saying.
I'm not sure though.
Yeah, I wish you would have clarified because I was like,
It's a little bit of a wet flotation situation.
Yes. Yeah.
He also notes that these have, I think he says, arguably some of the earliest Chinese characters found on tortoiseshell. I think that's very arguably, from what I have gathered from other professionals in the field so far. Fairly limited, I'll admit, but I think it's very arguable that this is actually writing. But it also becomes very much a political issue, so that complicates the matter a lot in this situation.
I did appreciate in this chapter specifically, I feel like he goes into greater detail regarding the the culture
Hmm.
and the culture itself, but also the culture surrounding like alcohol. I feel like in the last chapter that was a little lacking.
That's interesting too, because there's more documentation for that period, I believe.
Yeah.
So I think maybe this time he needed to extrapolate a little more, talk about possibilities rather than
Yeah.
last time he could just say, we know that this was really, they're
Yeah.
famous for this, because there isn't at least we'll say robust writing.
Yeah.
That you have some other
But I
periods.
did enjoy that part of this chapter. Like this was probably of the chapters we've read so far, this one was my favorite.
So yes, he's ready to start his samples. The jars come from things with that probably held liquid because it's long, narrow necks. That makes sense. Something that held
Which
liquid.
the fact that there was still liquid is so cool.
I don't think there was always liquid currently in the sample because he's working with sherds, right? He talks about some other cases where they
Okay.
open things up.
Okay.
I
Okay.
don't think with his samples himself he was doing that because he's just taking sherds back.
Yeah. Okay. You're right. You're right.
But they found beeswax, tartaric acid, and rice. Once again, kind of parallels what we were seeing with the Midas touch. Instead of, I think they had barley instead of rice. But other than that,
Well, and this was interesting too, is because there was a whole like discussion as to whether the tartaric acid came from grapes or hawthorn. So
right.
again, using that environmental context to extrapolate what could have been providing that chemical marker.
Right.
Because they know that hawthorn was available, and there's cultural uses for hawthorn
And
in
there
that
are
region.
wild native grapes, but these grapes were never cultivated
Domestically.
domestically. And there wasn't any domestic grapes until 2,500 years ago, I think it was.
Right. Yeah.
And they were actually brought in as Western grapes
Yeah.
and planted. So it seems, I think he makes a good case for it probably being hawthorn.
Right.
But there's no reason, 9,000 years ago, they could have been harvesting wild grapes even.
Yeah, and
Right.
if grapes were prevalent and you could just go out into the edge of the woods and grab them, there might not have been a need.
It might have depended on the season too,
yeah,
right?
Right.
Hawthorn, I imagine, keeps better than grapes do.
Yeah, I don't know,
So
but I thought it was cool because it shows how, again, the context is really, really important.
he does do a little talk about Chinese traditional medicine a couple times.
Yeah.
And basically observes that this is understudied by scientific Western terms, at least, and it's something that kind of needs to be worked on a little more.
Yeah.
I definitely agree because some of it probably we might find doesn't work, but almost certainly a lot of it would.
I mean, as long a history as it has of being useful and utilized, I feel like there has to be some merit to it.
Right, and a lot of it I bet does work, but we have stronger effects with other things available to us or something like that.
Yeah.
But he does observe how, was it hawthorn? What was it that resulted in some new cancer treatments?
I think it was hawthorn, yeah.
Yeah, because they studied hawthorn, they found, because of the work they did for this project. So if you go on a real application of archaeology and archaeological research, this project contributed to this. They chemically studied hawthorn, and they found some properties to it that has, at the time this book was written, which was in 2017, the hawthorn-based cancer treatment was actually approaching human trials, I think it was.
Yeah.
Wasn't at human trials yet. So, definitely has a ways to go at that point, but it's reached fairly prominent enough that they're investigating it, essentially.
Yeah. And as I always say, Tristan, archaeology matters.
Damn it.
It actually has real life applications.
Absolutely does. So they have all the data now that they're going to get from it chemically. So they bring it back to Sam in 2006, and he also wanted to credit another brewer, Mike Gerhardt, who's from Otter Creek Brewery in Vermont, because he actually made So part of the question I thought was interesting because apparently sometimes you could start a brew with a cake of grain, and I forget the detail, but it's something that they do with that cake that starts the process of getting it ready for fermentation.
Is this the one that has the mold?
It might be the mold.
Yeah. Like they I guess China has a history, and I guess some modern Chinese beers and brews are made using the fermented processes started using mold.
Mm-hmm.
But I know they again, he was like, chewing would be the most obvious way to go, but if we're gonna do this on a mass production, the modern day drinker might not be amenable to that.
Right. So the other options were
Mold.
but there was another one too.
Um,
There was mold was the least likely one, I believe that, right?
Mold sacrification is used today to make Chinese fermented cereal beverages. And I thought it was cool because he mentioned like how mold could be different per region. And so that adds like a different color or taste to the beer based on the mold. So it is used.
Mm-hmm. The other more likely one was letting the rice sprout first.
That's right. Yes.
And then that is introducing some enzymes.
Yes,
Yep.
which they do for, I know, like, I think some, especially like corn liquors and stuff like that,
Okay.
they'll sprout it.
Oh, and apparently herbs can also help.
Oh, yeah, which I thought was cool.
Right, but we don't have any real evidence that they were doing this with herbs.
Yeah.
So at this point.
And I guess when they were.
One of the. Sorry, it wasn't hawthorn that did the cancer treatment. It was one of the herbs that they were testing as a possible.
Was it wormwood?
The phrasing is a little weird, but I think, yes, it was wormwood. That's right. Wormwood or mugwort was one of the ones they were testing, and research on these things has led to new possible cancer treatments. I thought the phrasing was a little not quite clear on what was going on there, but I guess it's safe to say that this at least contributed to that.
Oh,
research.
yeah, and I guess wormwood was also an effective anti-malarial
Right.
too. So again, though, I think it speaks to how brewed beverages were used medicinally.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so it kind of changes my perspective on alcohol a little bit. I'm not, you know, which is
right. I mean, it changes my perspective a bit on the Victorian medicine.
Yeah.
Because we think of, Victorian medicine bottles, and they were almost all like 95% alcohol. And sometimes I know that was because it was more socially acceptable for women to take their medicine rather than to drink alcohol. But also, it has this long history of being used medicinally, whether or not it was, viable.
It was effective
for them,
or whatever. Yeah.
Or at the quantities they were drinking it, because it was always available, kind of a situation for them. But I can see where that came from, at least.
And I know too, when I was studying like native plants in Florida during the Civil War, when you had the blockades, the Confederate troops were taking like dogwood berries off of trees and steeping them in alcohol and using them for medicine. And I've always wondered, okay, like, did the berries do anything, or were they just getting drunk so it didn't hurt so much? You know what I'm saying? So like, yeah, there's always a lot of, I guess, questions surrounding how effective it was, but it does seem like, depending on the herbs and things you use in that brew, there is medicinal value.
Yeah.
Or can be medicinal value.
Yeah. So yes, the one early attempt at reproducing this was with the cake, like we talked about. The author felt like it wasn't sweet enough, which I thought was interesting. So their assumption here is that sweet things were fairly rare, so people would want a sweet drink.
Which I've heard in other contexts, but I feel like, is that just an assumption? I would want to see evidence.
Yeah, that feels like a big assumption to me.
Yeah, because like, again, it's just going back. Is it just assuming it based on like how, sugar is so widely available today and we eat more sweets? Is that an assumption, or do we know? Because I mean, if you look at like the Victorians and things like that, they ate wheat, they might.
But they could process sugar and stuff too.
Yeah, but like also, I feel like
fruits weren't that uncommon,
right? And fruits are sweet,
and even some vegetables have sweetness to them. So
yeah, we've always had a like propensity for sweet
because we need the sugar.
Yeah,
not as much as we do now, but
I also wonder, like, our standards for what is sweet may have differed greatly compared to people.
Well, it definitely differs culture to culture too.
Yeah, culture to culture it does,
like,
for sure.
Americans are pretty famous for a sweet tooth, and I know at least some of the Chinese people I've known are really perplexed by how sweet some American things always seem to be.
Yeah.
So apparently Sam was, like you said before, was very much down to chew, but they decided to not commit to that. At least right now, they actually released a different beer in the meantime before he actually got down to chewing.
Yeah, I did think the conversation around like the ingredients they used for this were interesting.
Yeah,
because they had to find close equivalents. Part of it because of import issues and availability, and also cost issues. So like using American wildflower honey instead of.
Well, they used orange blossom honey. He mentioned American wildflower honey when he's talking about the importance of honey, I think. But they
Yeah.
used orange blossom honey here. Yeah.
But then he like talked about how that would have been appropriate based on how citrus was available in China. And I guess like the Chinese were responsible for making like, I guess, developing citrus that was sweet.
Or oranges specifically.
Yeah, oranges that were sweet, which is interesting because being in Florida, we think of our citrus is coming from Spain. And I would be really interested in knowing the path that it took to become to like from China to Spain to Florida, or, you know, what that looked like.
Maybe someone's written a book we could read.
I know. Yeah.
So they wanted hawthorn fruit, but they had trouble getting that. So they used powdered hawthorn. Seemed like a reasonable compromise.
Yeah.
And then they used gelatinized rice malt with holes in bran. So one of the ideas is that this would not be, they would have all the holes and all the extra stuff mixed in. So they wanted that in the actual drink. And then they included no herbs just because they couldn't be sure there were any herbs.
Yeah. Which I feel like is a safe way to go. And at least then you get the base.
At least for one, right?
Yeah. You get the base. You understand what's going on with like the base ingredients, and then maybe based on cultural evidence or whatever else you can mix it up.
And then they used an American ale yeast for it just because I think that's what was available in America. And he does the usual naming and everything, and the label.
I did appreciate how the label for this one came from a dream Sam had. That's just cool.
So we've already kind of observed some overlap between this book style and Lassie the Monkey God.
Right.
And so this effort of them producing this beer actually got a little pushback apparently. And he doesn't, really address in depth the criticisms and everything, but he does at least present a response.
Yeah.
Which is one of the things we had problems with in the previous one.
Yeah.
He doesn't just make fun of them.
And so he was saying that a lot of, I don't know if it was the general Chinese public or like who specifically, he doesn't go into.
There was some of it.
Yeah.
And there was probably some newspapers or something.
Yeah. So it got a lot of attention, and some Chinese people were upset because they felt like, hey, this American company, this American brewery is making money off of our culture.
They stole our recipe.
And that's, yeah. And so I like the way he addressed it though, because he was like, ideally what would happen is a Chinese brewery would make this using more authentic, locally available ingredients.
And their own interpretation.
Yeah. And so he's not like trying to lay claim to it. He was, in my mind, I feel like he was just kind of the catalyst.
Yeah. And so he does also point out that 3 of the 6 co-authors on the scientific paper were Chinese.
And I'll also point out too, something I thought about is he was invited there, which I think is a little bit, it's a different dynamic.
Yeah. And the recipe is freely available.
Yeah.
The one they use.
It is in the book.
Yes. Actually, if you are a brewer, you should definitely check out this book because all of the beers, he has recipes and detailed recipes on how they're made.
And food pairings and recipes for the food pairings, which I was going through, and there was I think it was like a spicy tofu, and I was like, I had made a note because I was like, oh, Tristan. So I'm halfway tempted. I'm not promising this, but I'm halfway tempted to make one of these for us. And maybe we can report back, let y'all know how it was, provide our review. We'll see. Not the beer. I can't homebrew. I've tried it. I can't homebrew. I was talking about the food.
Okay.
I've tried homebrewing. I think I'm a better bartender than brewer. Let's just say that.
Uh-huh.
But yeah, I did appreciate how he acknowledged it and just the way he feels about it. Like he's like, this would be really cool if he's not possessing it.
And it's not a secret. They're not like keeping it from anybody.
Yeah.
Like anyone in the world could get this and try and reproduce.
Yeah. And if anybody does or has, let us know. Tell us how it was, because I would love, we're not opposed to being your official archaeological taste testers either.
Right. We could do this. And so that kind of wraps it up. He just kind of finishes with this is his favorite one, I think, because he won an award with it that he's very fond of.
Yeah. And I think it's cool too, because this specific brew is the oldest chemically confirmed alcoholic beverage in the world. And I like all the qualifiers.
Yeah. He's adding all the appropriate perfect qualifiers there.
Yeah. And I feel like that's what we do as archaeologists too. We're like, this is the oldest because of this, and this.
Well, it's like the fight between St.
St.
Augustine and
Augustine.
Pensacola. St. Augustine is the oldest continually occupied European settlement in the North Americas. Pensacola is the oldest multi-year settlement attempt.
Yes.
Because they failed and left, and then they came back later.
And we do love arguing about it.
Oh,
you get some people from St. Augustine, some people from Pensacola, of which we have offices in both places. It's fun. It's fun.
I love getting them stirred up. It's one of my favorite things to do.
Yeah, and we just sit back and we're like, well, we're Tallahassee.
Yeah.
We won. We're the capital.
Wait, I thought Pensacola was older. Yeah, I think that wraps us up for the book today. How's it going for you, Barbara?
I've really enjoyed it. There were some parts that, like I said, I have used this book for research purposes, but I haven't read it from cover to cover. And so when I'm using it for research purposes, I'm looking at like the archaeology stuff. And I unexpectedly am enjoying his little side stories and tangents because I feel like it helps develop this into something that is more approachable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I find some of his tangents, I find myself wondering, okay, what's the point here? And ultimately, there kind of is not always necessarily a strong point, but I don't necessarily resent it, I think is a key. And then another thing that stood out to me, contrasting with our previous book, remember I had some issues with, it felt like there was not much of a narrative for some chapters of that. He is really good at building a narrative for you to follow here.
I will say I was kind of concerned about that just because the premise of the book is like each chapter is about a beer.
Mm-hmm.
I expected it to be more procedural, I guess, and not as like well written narratively.
Yeah.
Like I didn't expect it to be as much of a story as it is. And I've really enjoyed that part.
That's the thing I've heard. I think it was the Alan Alda. There's an Alan Alda based organization about educating scientists to communicate their work. And one of their big things I know they talk about is, put yourself in your research. Talk about your successes. Talk about your failures. Talk about what you tried this and this. And I think he's doing that here very, very well. I don't know if he's trained by them.
I was wondering that. Yeah.
But he's got that stuff figured out, I think, at least in this book for sure. So I'm really, really, really enjoying reading these. Yeah.
So for next month, we're going to read, I think, the next 3 chapters. So that would be chapter 4 through 6. And I'm not going to try and pronounce what beers they are. I'm going to have to do some research before I try that.
And then still probably mess it up.
Yeah. Look, I'm trying my best. So, join us on this adventure. And like we said, if you have brewed any of these or cooked any of the recipes in here, comment. Let us know how they were, what you learned from them.
If you've just brewed and have any thoughts or opinions about the things they've tried and how they would work, I'd love to hear some of that.
Yeah, because like I said, not a home brewer, tried it, not my thing. But I do appreciate the art and the science behind it. Brewers are some of my favorite people. They're so passionate. So we would love to hear from you.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think that wraps us up this time.
Yeah.
Look forward to hearing about the next 3 chapters next month. Until then, we'll see you all next time.
Happy reading, everybody.
Archaeology Books for Fun is brought to you by the Florida Public Archaeology Network, a program of the University of West Florida. You can find out more about archaeology and about FPAN at fpan.us. We appreciate any feedback, so if you're listening to us as a podcast, please leave us a review, and if you're watching this on YouTube, please like and subscribe. Thanks for listening.